The first sign something was wrong was the lipstick stain on my goat, right between her eyes. Bright red, like someone had tried to give her a makeover. Now, I don't know how parties work in the suburbs, but out here on my ranch, animals don't typically show up the morning after looking like they've been to Vegas. And yet there was Gertrude, my oldest goat, blinking at me like she had trauma to unpack and only her therapist could handle it. That's when I saw the hay, half-stomped, glitter-covered, and scattered like a wedding had fought a tornado and lost. I stepped into the barn and stopped dead. My workbench was covered in red Solo cups. A stream of confetti trailed toward the stall doors, and someone had duct-taped a disco ball to my rafters. A disco ball. In a livestock barn. The whole place smelled like cheap rose, spilled perfume, and betrayal. There were high-heel scuff marks in the dirt, a pair of broken sunglasses by the feed bin, and most insulting of all, my backup emergency grain bucket was missing, replaced with what I could only assume was a champagne cooler made from my best galvanized steel pail. I ran to my security monitor in the loft. Blank. No footage. The system had been wiped. My stomach dropped. The only way someone could do that was if they knew what they were doing, or if they got really, really lucky. I'd spent years outfitting this place with smart tech, not just for protection, but because I loved my land. This barn wasn't just a building, it was my sanctuary. A place my late grandfather and I rebuilt together after a storm took the original one out. He used to say, "Respect the land, or the land'll remember you." At that moment, I was beginning to understand exactly what he meant. Outside, my cows were standing suspiciously far from the barn, like they'd seen things they weren't ready to process. One of them, Bessie, was still wearing what looked like a party streamer around her horn. I followed the trail of glitter out toward the side fence and noticed tire tracks. Expensive ones. Low profile. Definitely not the kind of tires you'd find on a farm truck. That's when I got the first clue. Wedged under a post was a printed cocktail menu, laminated in glossy plastic, labeled Rustic Elegance. A barn affair, hosted by Karen W. I squinted at the logo in the corner. The HOA. Of course. Of course it was Karen. If she weren't so damn predictable, I might have been shocked. But Karen, president of the local HOA and full-time menace, had long considered herself queen of the community. She was the kind of person who'd send a fine for having too many sunflowers in your front yard, and once tried to outlaw wind chimes for causing auditory clutter. I didn't live inside the HOA development. I owned the land next to it, 30 acres of inherited ranch that bordered their cookie-cutter kingdom. Karen hated that. She hated that she couldn't tell me what to do. She'd filed complaints. Threatened to beautify the view. Tried to claim my fence was 2 feet too tall. None of it worked. Now it seemed she'd found a new tactic: trespassing. I stormed into town, still holding the laminated drink menu like it was a wanted poster. My buddy Rex was at the diner, sipping coffee and looking like he'd wrestled a hornet hive. "You hear about your barn?" he asked, not even looking up. "I'm hearing it from you right now," I growled. "Oh, she was bragging at the HOA meeting last night," Rex said. Said something like, "He wasn't using it and I made it beautiful. Everyone had the best time. She even hired a DJ. Some kid with a fog machine and 2 speakers duct-taped to a hay rake." I couldn't believe it. Scratch that, I could believe it. What I couldn't believe was that she'd done it thinking there wouldn't be consequences. She didn't even bother asking permission. She used my family barn like it was a community rec hall and expected me to just be fine with it? That's when the switch flipped. Karen didn't know what I'd built in that barn. She didn't know that I'd rigged the rafters with zone-based sprinklers, part of a custom climate control system I'd designed for delicate crop. She didn't know the floors had smart sensors. She didn't know about the hidden PA system, the programmable lights, the hay drop pulleys, or the multi-nozzle scent release rig I'd created for natural pest deterrent, which doubled as the world's worst party perfume. She didn't know. But she would. I headed back home with one mission: if she ever tried to throw another party in my barn, I'd let her. In fact, I'd encourage it. And when she did, I would unleash hell. I started prepping immediately. Cleaned up just enough to hide the tech. Replaced the missing grain bucket. Calibrated the sprinklers. Rewrote the software to activate zones and waves. So it'd start with a gentle mist, then gradually flood the room like Poseidon had RSVP'd. I rigged the scent system with my special mix of skunk musk and expired cologne. The lights would flash like a rave, and the sound system? Goat screams and chicken squawks all night long. And the best part? The camera system now backed up wirelessly to a cloud server I controlled, complete with facial recognition tagging. I'd have footage. Evidence. Internet gold. Back in town, the flyers started going up. Karen had officially announced Barn Bash 2.0 as an exclusive rustic gathering for HOA members and VIP guests. I made sure to RSVP anonymously through a burner account, just to keep tabs. As I stared at the invite, something unexpected twisted in my chest. This barn was where I used to sit with my grandfather, learning how to fix fence posts and listen to the wind. Now it was being used for rose raggers and Instagram posts. It made me angry. But more than that, it made me ready. Not just for revenge, but for righteous revenge. This wasn't just payback. This was justice, with a splash of theatrics and a gallon of pressurized water. If Karen thought she was going to throw a party on my land, she better be ready to dance in the storm. Because next time she stepped into my barn, she wouldn't be walking into a party. She'd be walking into a trap. And I'd be watching it all from above, popcorn in hand, ready to make it rain. The week leading up to the event felt like the calm before a fireworks show, quiet, tense, and buzzing with the anticipation of a good explosion. Karen, oblivious to the trap she was walking into, went full throttle into event planning mode. She printed new flyers, this time glossier and more obnoxious, and handed them out door to door in the HOA neighborhood like she was running for office. Her pitch? A chic, under-the-stars barn soiree complete with hors d'oeuvres, craft cocktails, a string quartet, and a surprise performance. That last part made me nervous for a second, until I realized it was probably just her husband lip-syncing to Michael Bublé again, like he did at last year's 4th of July barbecue. Still, I wasn't taking any chances. I started laying the groundwork, literally. I reinforced the floor with anti-slip coating, activated the soap mist for the final layer, and recalibrated the sprinkler system for timed wave. Zone Alpha would activate first, just a light drizzle to confuse people. Then, Beta, Gamma, and Delta would kick in one after the other, slowly building to full barn monsoon. I also upgraded the sound system to include randomized animal screams and a loop of ominous banjo music. If you've never heard banjo in minor key while soaked and confused, you haven't truly panicked. I knew I had to make it look like I wasn't home. Karen would never go through with her stunt if she thought I was nearby. So I scheduled a series of fake vacation posts using old photos from a fishing trip in Florida. I even changed my voicemail to say I was off the grid for the next 10 days. It was barely 2. Meanwhile, I stocked the barn loft with snacks, charged all my camera batteries, and brought in Cinnamon, my cat, as moral support and general chaos consultant. I also needed backup, so I paid Rex a visit. His place smelled like smoked honey and beeswax, as usual, and he answered the door with a crossbow in one hand and a sandwich in the other. I explained the plan, and before I could even finish, he was nodding enthusiastically. Not only did he volunteer to rig some extra distractions, but he also offered me one of his infamous scent bombs, guaranteed to smell like skunk mixed with expired gym socks and fermented onions. We named it Karen's Karma. Rex and I spent the next 2 days reinforcing every part of the barn. He installed micro firecrackers that would pop harmlessly under pressure to simulate electrical short. We added strobe lights disguised as barn lamps and a hidden fog machine behind the hay bales. But we also made sure to protect the animals. Gertrude and the rest of the goats were relocated to Rex's place for the weekend, safely out of range from chaos. The cows stayed in the lower field, far from the action. As much as I wanted this party to go sideways, I wasn't about to put my animals through another round of HOA nonsense. On the night before the event, I got my confirmation. One of Karen's minions, a woman named Deborah who always wore sunglasses indoors and called everyone hun, showed up again near my property. I watched from the loft window as she paced the barn, clipboard in hand, muttering about twinkle lights and catering entrances. She never once checked for the owner. Didn't knock, didn't call. Just walked around like she was surveying her own wedding venue. When she left, she taped a laminated VIP parking sign to my fence. The next morning, I activated stealth mode. I parked my truck down the road behind some brush, climbed up into the barn loft early, and nestled into my command center. I had snacks, drinks, 3 portable power banks, a high-speed Wi-Fi hotspot, and a remote control system labeled with nothing but chaos. My screens flickered to life, showing multiple angles from inside and outside the barn. Everything was quiet for now, but the clock was ticking. Around 6 in the evening, the first SUV pulled up. A white Lexus with vanity plates that read, Quink. Of course. Karen stepped out in a full-length gown that sparkled like she'd wrestled a disco ball and won. She was followed by her entourage, equally overdressed and oblivious. One of them was dragging a giant cooler with gold lettering on the side. Another held a stack of what looked like raffle tickets. Within minutes, people started flooding in. The barn lit up with fairy lights, battery-powered chandeliers, and a DJ booth so large it blocked half the feed room. Karen raised her wine glass and toasted to taking something forgotten and making it beautiful. I nearly choked on my soda. The DJ kicked off the music. Generic pop country remixes, exactly what you'd expect from people who line dance once a year and think it's cultural appreciation. The crowd swayed, danced, and took selfies in front of my hay bales like they were at Coachella's redneck cousin. A small child knocked over a crate of tools. A woman in stilettos stepped in goat poop and shrieked like she'd been shot. All of it was beautiful. I waited. I watched. Then, as Karen got on the makeshift microphone to announce some ridiculous raffle prize for Best Boots, I tapped the first button. Sprinkler Zone Alpha hissed to life. At first, it was subtle, just a faint mist from the rafters. People looked up, confused. Some thought it was part of the ambience. Karen waved her hand and shouted something about rustic humidity. But within 30 seconds, people were wiping water from their phones and ducking under tables. Then I hit beta. Now the water came in bursts, stronger, colder. Makeup started running. Hair flattened. The DJ screamed and tried to cover his speakers with a tarp. Someone slipped and took down a whole dessert table. Still, Karen refused to believe this wasn't just technical difficulties. She yelled at Deborah to fix it. That's when I hit gamma. The strobe lights kicked in. The fog machine blasted. The scent bomb triggered. Karen's karma filled the air. People gagged, gasped, and ran for the exit. But the soap mist on the floor had activated too, making the exit a slip and slide of misery. The screams were drowned out by the speakers now playing a loop of angry goat noises. I watched as someone crashed into the disco ball, which shattered, raining shards like dollar store glitter doom. And then, finally Delta. The hay drop. 12 hay bales fell from the loft on preset tracks, blocking the main exit dramatically, but safely. People were trapped in a wet, stinking, flashing barn of horror. Karen stood in the middle, drenched, confused, mascara streaked down her cheeks, screaming into the void. I activated the microphone. My voice echoed across the chaos. Hi Karen. Thanks for choosing my barn. Be sure to tag me next time, at You Should Have Asked. She looked up in shock as the final sprinkler wave hit, soaking her gown completely. The crowd scrambled. Shoes were lost. A man in cowboy boots fell face first into a hay pile and didn't get up for a full minute. I leaned back in my chair, Cinnamon curled up beside me, and I smiled. This was only the beginning. The barn was a war zone. Guests stumbled around like survivors of a very glamorous natural disaster, slipping on soap-slick floors, clawing their way toward exits blocked by hay bales, screaming over the sound of mechanical goat cries and the relentless downpour from my overhead sprinkler system. Karen stood in the center of it all, soaking wet and vibrating with outrage, her sequin-covered dress clinging to her like it had given up on its purpose in life. Her once perfectly coiffed hair now looked like a drowned poodle, and her makeup was streaked down her face in tragic, mascara-stained lines that made her look like she'd been crying glitter. I almost felt bad for her. Almost. But then she shrieked, "This is sabotage! Who did this?" And I remembered exactly who I was dealing with. From my loft perch, I had a perfect view. The fog machine had filled the lower barn with mist, making everything below look like a haunted hayride gone wrong. People crawled. Some army crawled. One guy tried to surf a metal feed tray out the door. A woman clutched a bottle of champagne to her chest like it was a life preserver. The DJ had given up completely and was hiding behind the generator table, rocking back and forth with his laptop wrapped in a trash bag. Karen stomped forward, slipping every third step, and screamed into the fog, "You can't do this! I'm the HOA president!" Her voice echoed pathetically through the speaker system, which only made it worse when I hit the button that triggered the looping recording I'd made earlier that day. It was Karen herself, recorded from the previous HOA meeting. "He wasn't using the barn. I made it beautiful. I improved it. He should be thanking me." Her voice bounced around the barn like karma in Dolby surround sound. Several guests froze. A few turned to stare at her. One guy, soaked and miserable, shouted, "Wait, this wasn't your barn?" Another woman, mascara dripping like rain, screamed, "You told us this was some rental space. I paid for valet parking." That last part was extra funny because there was no valet. Just Deborah's son in a reflective vest who'd taken tips and then parked cars randomly along my property line, one of which had already been trampled by curious cows. Karen turned pale, then red, then some alarming shade of purple. This is just a misunderstanding." She stammered, but then the final part of my master plan kicked in. Rex's timing was impeccable. From behind the barn, just outside the view of the guests, he launched 2 scent bombs, small, harmless canisters filled with what can only be described as nature's revenge. They burst through the open side windows with a hiss, releasing the pungent blend we'd nicknamed Karen's Karma straight into the heart of the chaos. Within seconds, people were gagging, coughing, and yelling in horror. It was like a skunk had made a nest inside a gym sock and decided to die heroically. Karen shrieked again and tried to climb onto a wooden barrel to escape the mess, but the barrel slipped out from under her, and she fell backward into a puddle of her own ego. The entire barn had descended into full-blown panic. Phones were dead. Hair was ruined. Social reputations were drowning. I waited until the chaos reached its peak, then activated the barn doors remotely. They swung open with a dramatic creak, releasing a flood of wet, angry partygoers into the night. People poured out, coughing, tripping, some of them barefoot, most of them swearing. Some of them tried to maintain their dignity, walking with straight backs and a fake laugh as they tried to pretend they hadn't just been assaulted by soap, strobe lights, and the stench of failure. Karen stayed behind, fuming and dripping, staring at the hay bales as if she could make them combust with sheer will. I watched her from the loft, and for a moment I thought she might try to climb up to me. But then she spotted one of the security cameras and screamed, "You're going to regret this." I leaned into the mic one last time. "Hope you enjoyed the rustic elegance. Next time, book through the proper channels." Karen screamed something unintelligible and stormed out into the night, stomping through puddles and flinging glitter like an angry fairy godmother with a grudge. I let out a long breath, slumped into my chair, and finally let the adrenaline start to fade. Cinnamon hopped onto my lap and purred like she'd personally orchestrated the whole thing. Maybe she had. The next morning was even better than the party. By sunrise, the footage had already been uploaded to a few key places. Reddit, TikTok. A particularly dramatic cut went to YouTube with the title, Karen Flooded by Barn Owner After Illegal Party. It had over 100,000 views before noon. I didn't even need to promote it, people did that for me. The hashtags alone told the story. Hashtag barnjustice, hashtag you should have asked, hashtag soaked and entitled. By mid-afternoon, it had gone completely viral. National viral. A local news station picked it up and ran a segment with dramatic reenactments using barn animals. Someone on TikTok wrote a sea shanty about Karen's downfall. The goat scream loop was turned into a remix. It was art. Pure, ridiculous, satisfying art. The best part? The audio from the HOA meeting had clearly captured Karen admitting to using my barn without permission. That alone was enough for legal recourse. I didn't even need to press charges. Just sending the footage to the HOA board was enough to create a storm bigger than the one I'd unleashed in the barn. I got a call from the HOA treasurer that afternoon. His voice was panicked, full of forced politeness. He offered me a formal apology. Asked what it would take to make this all go away. I told him I didn't want anything, just Karen out. He sighed and said, "That may already be happening." Apparently, several HOA members had already called for an emergency vote to remove her from her position. Complaints were flooding in. Guests wanted refunds. One person threatened to sue for emotional damage because they had never smelled anything so awful in their life. Someone else claimed their designer shoes had been destroyed and demanded compensation. Karen had bragged about this event for weeks. Now she was a meme. And memes, as we know, never die. I sat on my porch that night with a cold drink in hand, watching the sun set over the now peaceful barn. The disco ball was gone, the hay bales were back in place, and my animals were calm again. Gertrude even gave me a look of approval before headbutting a bucket. I raised my glass to her. Justice had been served. And it came with water pressure, scent bombs, and a backup goat scream track. Exactly as it should. Karen's rage hit the community like a rogue lawn mower in a rose garden. Loud, chaotic, and leaving behind more damage than anyone asked for. Within hours of the viral explosion, she started her counterattack. She filed a police report accusing me of mechanically assaulting her party guests and illegally deploying a barn-based tactical weapon. I kid you not, those were her exact words. The officer she spoke to called me afterward, mostly to laugh. He said it was the first time in 20 years he'd had to write down barn-based tactical weapon in an official statement. The cops came out, took one look at the setup, and walked away shaking their heads, saying, "Well, she really did it to herself." Karen wasn't done. She sent a letter to the HOA trying to spin the entire situation into some bizarre tale of betrayal. She claimed I had pretended to give her permission for the barn, then booby-trapped it out of spite. She even attached photos of herself soaked and sobbing in the mud, like some kind of martyr for the suburban elite. Her caption read, "This is what happens when good people try to bring beauty into broken places." That same afternoon, someone took her crying barn photo and edited it into a fake movie poster titled, Moist and Entitled. The Karening. I printed it out and framed it above my toolbox. The HOA, however, was not amused. The footage I provided made its rounds behind closed doors, and soon, HOA members who once sucked up to Karen like she walked on solar-powered pavement were jumping ship. An emergency board meeting was called, and even though I didn't attend, I got updates from Rex, who went as an observer. According to him, the meeting turned into a verbal brawl about unauthorized funds, fake permits, and embezzled decoration fees. Turns out Karen had used the HOA's community fund to pay for her ridiculous party expenses: flowers, lights, rental gear, catering, even her personal stylist. The board demanded a full financial audit. Karen screamed something about witch hunts and slammed her water bottle down like she was auditioning for a reality show. 2 days later, she was suspended pending investigation. By the end of the week, Her resignation letter was sent to all residents with the most passive-aggressive subject line imaginable, a difficult but necessary goodbye. Without Karen at the helm, the HOA began damage control. I received a formal apology signed by the new interim president, along with a gift basket of artisan cheeses, which I gave to Gertrude and the cows as tribute. A few neighbors who had been at the party came by to apologize in person. Most were embarrassed. Some were angry that they'd been misled. One guy, still damp in spirit, just stared at the barn and whispered, "Never again." It was like they'd walked through some kind of suburban purgatory and come out the other side changed forever. The best moment, however, came a few days later. I got a knock at the door. When I opened it, there stood Karen, holding a fruit basket wrapped in cellophane, flanked by a man holding a DSLR camera with a shotgun mic attached. She smiled like she'd practiced it in the mirror. "Hello, neighbor," she said sweetly, as if we hadn't just been locked in a suburban Cold War. "I just wanted to extend an olive branch, and maybe clear the air? I'm filming a little piece for my brand's YouTube channel. Redemption arc, you know?" I didn't even respond. I just turned around, walked to my hose spigot, twisted it on full blast, and sprayed the both of them with a jet of freezing well water. The fruit basket exploded. The cameraman dropped his rig and screamed. Karen shrieked like someone had launched her soul into space. Then I turned off the water, tipped my hat, and shut the door. I figured that was the end of it. But like a sequel nobody asked for, Karen's drama continued to unravel behind the scenes. An anonymous email, probably sent by one of the former board members, leaked internal documents showing Karen had been funneling HOA money into personal projects for months. Landscaping bills for properties she didn't own. Catering invoices for board meetings that had suspiciously expensive wine lists. Even a line item marked Executive Wellness Retreat that turned out to be a spa day she and Deborah took after yelling at a teenager for skateboarding on a sidewalk. With the community's patience gone, the city got involved. A municipal ethics officer opened an inquiry into HOA fund mismanagement. Karen's accounts were flagged. Her reputation, once inflated by false authority and overpriced floral arrangements, deflated faster than a party balloon in August. I heard she started selling homemade essential oils online under the name Cleansed by Karen, but reviews were brutal. One simply said, "Smells like goat revenge and regret." While her downfall was entertaining, I had no interest in dragging it out. I turned my attention back to the barn, slowly restoring it to what it had been, calm, clean, and goat-friendly. I reinstalled the security system with triple redundancy. I upgraded the camera backups, added motion-sensitive lighting, and put up a new sign over the entrance. Private property, entry by invite only. Parties will be hosed. It was more than a warning. It was a philosophy. To celebrate the return of peace, I decided to throw my own party. A real one. No glitz. No glam. Just good people, music, and food that didn't require garnish. I invited the folks who'd stuck by me, who had apologized, who helped clean up or stood on the sidelines cheering me on. Rex brought his honey whiskey. Deborah, now on a personal redemption arc of her own, showed up with homemade pies and even helped wash down the barn walls. I let her stay, mostly because she said sorry without a camera in her face, and because her apple pie was suspiciously excellent. We grilled steaks out by the pasture. Kids ran through the open field with sparklers. Gertrude wore a flower crown and seemed to approve of the festivities. At one point, we all gathered inside the barn, and someone suggested we sign the inside wall. We grabbed permanent markers and took turns adding our names, messages, and ridiculous quote. Mine read, "If you throw glitter on a goat, it'll remember." It felt right, like things were finally back in balance. A few weeks later, I got a letter from a real estate developer offering to buy the barn. Said he wanted to turn it into a rustic wedding venue, promised big returns, said it would be the next big thing. I laughed and threw the letter in the fire pit. The barn wasn't for sale. Not then. Not ever. It wasn't just a building. It was a story now. A fortress. A symbol. People still bring it up when I go into town. The legend of Karen's downfall. The Great Barn Bash. Every time someone mentions it, I grin, because no matter what, I know the truth. I didn't just protect my land. I defended it with humor, creativity, and a well-pressured hose. And in the end, that's all it took to wash away the nonsense and remind everyone around here exactly where the line is. It had been a few peaceful weeks since the barn battle, and for the first time in a long while, I could walk outside without the lingering scent of hairspray, glitter, and overpriced entitlement clinging to the air. The grass had grown back where Karen's valet guests had trampled it into mush. The cows grazed calmly near the fence, the goats were back to head-butting buckets instead of dodging disco lights, and the barn stood proud and quiet, like it had just won a war and was enjoying early retirement. But if there's one thing I've learned about people like Karen, it's this: they never leave without one last pathetic attempt at a comeback. It started innocently enough. A man in khakis and a tucked-in polo shirt pulled up to the edge of my driveway one afternoon in a shiny SUV and walked up with the gait of someone who thought he was about to change my life. He introduced himself as a representative from a wedding event company and said he was very impressed with the rustic charm of my property. He talked fast, like a salesman trying to distract you from the fine print. Said they'd seen the barn in that viral video, and thought it would make the perfect venue for upscale countryside weddings. Rustic elegance, but with urban luxury touches. Whatever that meant. I asked him who sent him. He hesitated for just a second too long, then muttered that his client wanted to remain anonymous. I didn't need a crystal ball to figure out who was behind it. Karen, of course. Probably trying to rebrand herself or bounce back under a different business name, like some suburban phoenix rising from the ashes of soggy tulle and failed glitter bombs. I smiled politely, told him no thanks, and sent him on his way. He left a glossy brochure behind. I fed it to Gertrude. A few days later, I got an email from a corporate-sounding address offering to lease the barn for seasonal event. It was filled with buzzwords like activation space, experiential branding, and influencer synergy. I forwarded it to Rex, who replied with a picture of a chicken giving the middle finger. That about summed it up. I didn't reply. But then came the real kicker. A certified envelope showed up in my mailbox. Inside was a letter from a lawyer, Karen's, apparently demanding compensation for damages to personal property, public humiliation, and irreversible emotional distress. She was threatening to sue me for theatrical assault with intent to embarrass. I laughed so hard I nearly fell off my porch swing. She had the nerve to include a list of claimed damages, including the cost of her gown, her makeup, her phone, and, this part made me snort, emotional repair therapy sessions totaling $3,000. She was billing me for her own inability to understand boundaries. I sent the letter straight to my own lawyer, who knew the whole story and already had a thick folder labeled Karen Shenanigans. He called me 15 minutes later and said, I'd love to see her try. Apparently, by throwing a party on my private property without permission, Karen had actually opened herself up to multiple liabilities, and if she pushed, I could countersue. My lawyer even used the phrase, trespass with social intent, which sounded both ridiculous and weirdly satisfying. Then came the cherry on top. Karen herself showed up one morning, marching down my driveway in full makeup and a white blazer like she was on her way to host a talk show. She held a manila envelope and a clipboard, flanked by two women with tight ponytails and matching pens. She didn't even knock. She stood outside my barn and started barking orders at her assistants, telling them to visualize where the reception would go and measure the lighting angles for golden hour. I didn't know whether to laugh or grab a hose. I walked out slowly, sipping my coffee, and asked, "Didn't we already do this?" Karen turned, wearing that wide fake smile that barely concealed her fury. "This is business," she said. "I'm willing to let bygones be bygones. I'm relaunching my event brand, and your barn is ideal for our new image. We'll pay you handsomely for every weekend. You don't even have to do anything, just hand over the keys and let us elevate the space." I blinked. "You mean the space you illegally used, trashed, and then blamed me for defending?" Her eye twitched. "Look, I'm offering you a deal. This is a second chance, for both of us." I didn't respond. I simply walked over to the side of the barn, flipped the newly installed switch labeled Discouragement Protocol, and triggered the sprinklers. They kicked on with a loud hiss, spraying a direct stream of cold water in a wide arc. Karen screamed, tried to run, slipped in a puddle, and landed flat on her back in the mud. One of her assistants dropped her clipboard. The other ran. Gertrude bleated in slow applause. I stood over Karen, coffee still in hand, and said, "Second chances are for people who know how to ask the first time." After that, the visits stopped. The emails dried up. And Karen, soaked and defeated, finally seemed to vanish from my life, for good this time. I kept the barn locked tighter than ever, but not out of fear. It was mine again, fully and completely. I repaired the damage, repainted the interior, and even added a few new touches. Extra lighting, better hay loft storage, a reinforced gate. The goats approved. Rex even carved a plaque that read "Battle Barn" and hung it above the main door. We all signed it with wood-burned initials and date. Then, in the most poetic twist of fate, the local VFW chapter reached out. They'd heard about the party disaster and thought it was hilarious. They asked if they could use the barn for their annual veterans gathering. I said yes with pride. That weekend, we hosted a real celebration: barbecue, music, flags, laughter. No fog machines. No glitter. Just good people, good food, and a space that finally felt whole again. As the sun set that night, I sat in a chair outside the barn, listening to the fading sound of country tunes and laughter echoing through the field. Gertrude stood beside me, her head resting on my knee like a tired old watchdog. For the first time in a long while, there was no tension in the air. Just peace. I looked up at the stars, the barn glowing softly behind me, and thought about everything that had happened. The invasion. The chaos. The ridiculousness of it all. And I smiled. Because in the end, I hadn't just protected my barn, I'd proven a point. Boundaries matter. Respect matters. And sometimes, the best kind of justice is delivered with a sprinkler system and a little bit of country know-how.